Today I'll be talking about the Cold War. In 1960, there was an incident with a U-2 spy plane in Soviet airspace. This American U-2 spy plane was shot down on May 1st, 1960. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. The Soviets convicted Powers on espionage charges and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. After serving less than 2 years, he was released in exchange for a captured Soviet agent in the first ever U.S.-Soviet spy swap. Soviet Colonel Rudolf Abel, a senior KGB spy who had been caught in the United States 5 years earlier, was exchanged for Gary Powers. This incident raised tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets. A great movie that depicts events regarding this spy swap was Bridge of Spies. If you've seen that movie, you're familiar with some of these events. If not, I highly recommend it. Next, we'll be talking about the Vietnam War, a brief history of Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony before World War I. It was conquered by Japan during World War II. During and after World War II, nationalism grew in Vietnam, and a movement was made to oust the Japanese and French by a guerrilla leader, Ho Chi Minh. Ho and his guerrillas beat the French, and in 1954, the Geneva Agreements, Vietnam was divided into two nations. North Vietnam would be communist, and South Vietnam would be free. When under French control, Vietnam was known as Indochina. The Vietnam War broke out in 1965 and continued until 1973. North Vietnam and its communist allies had attempted to spread communism to South Vietnam by invading using their official army and the Viet Cong guerrillas. The U.S., sticking to its containment policy, sent troops, 500,000 U.S. troops, to defend South Vietnam. The U.S. feared the domino theory. If one nation falls to communism, all Southeast Asian countries would fall like dominoes. The Soviet Union and China sent military aid, but no troops, to North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The Tet Offensive took place in 1968, and this changed the war for the U.S., and President Nixon began Vietnamization, the process of turning control over to the local South Vietnamese officials while slowly withdrawing U.S. troops. In 1973, after a long struggle against a hidden enemy, guerrilla warfare, the U.S. signed a peace treaty and left North Vietnam, which ended up conquering South Vietnam, and it did unify the country into a single communist state. Because South Vietnam was taken over by communists, this is seen as a failure of the containment policy. The war was not popular in the United States. Next year, you'll learn more details about this. There were Viet Cong tunnel complexes built, and you might be walking over one of these tunnels and not even be aware that it was there. U.S. casualties in Vietnam: over 58,000 U.S. service members were killed in action, 303,000 wounded in action, and almost 2,000 missing in action, according to the reports in 2008. Next, we'll talk about the space race. We're going to start with Sputnik. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite, into orbit. This meant the Soviet Union had technology to build and send an object into Earth orbit. The U.S. wanted to have that technology too. They didn't want the Soviets getting ahead of them. If you've seen the movie October Sky or read the book, that's set in this time period. Then, a month later, the Soviets launched another Sputnik into Earth orbit. This one had a dog, Laika, and Laika became the first sent from Earth into Earth orbit. In 1961, Soviets sent the first human into space. In the Soviet Union, they called their astronauts cosmonauts. Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space, was a Soviet cosmonaut. He completed one Earth orbit before safely returning to Earth. In response to the Soviets in space, in 1958, the U.S. created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. This was a response to the Soviet launch of Sputnik. They didn't want the Soviets being ahead of them with this technology. They started Project Mercury in 1958, and this project finished in 1963. It was followed up by Project Gemini and then the Apollo project, which put man on the moon. The goal of Mercury was to put a human in space. And in the Mercury project, they conducted 6 manned flights from 1961 until 1963. Alan Shepard was the first American in space on May 5, 1961. He had a 15-minute mission. Later, he would go to the moon and also fly on a space shuttle. With the announcement of Project Mercury, 7 astronauts were chosen who would work in this project. There's a Mercury capsule that would send one individual into space at a time, and each mission had its own mission patch. Don Glenn was the 3rd American to go into space, but he's the first American to orbit the Earth. He was part of Project Mercury, and this took place in February 1962. President Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." He also said, "This is a new ocean, and I believe the U.S. must sail on it." The Soviet Union, again, had put a satellite into space before the United States and put a human into space before we did as well. So the U.S. wanted to catch up because they didn't want their enemy having so much technology. June 20th, 1969, the U.S. successfully landed on the moon with astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Michael Collins was also part of this crew, and he remained on the craft that continued to orbit the moon while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on its surface. And they did safely return to Earth. Next, I want to do an overview of Soviet leaders, and then we'll talk about the last years of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. So Vladimir Lenin was the first leader of the Soviet Union, followed by Joseph Stalin. Then you had Nikita Khrushchev, and he was the Soviet premier during the Warsaw Pact and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Leonid Brezhnev was another Soviet premier. He was known for imprisoning critics of his government and building up the military. He also invaded Afghanistan to strengthen Soviet power. He pursued disarmament with the United States, but also declared that the Soviet Union had military obligation in all Warsaw Pact countries. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last premier of the Soviet Union. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to end Cold War tensions. He pulled the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan and rejected Brezhnev's military claims to Warsaw nations. He worked with U.S. President Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, known as the Iron Lady, to end tensions and competitions. He put in reforms. Glasnost is probably his most popular reform. Glasnost meant, literally translated, openness. He wanted Soviets to openly discuss the nation's issues. He ended censorship and allowed for free speech. Another one of his reforms was perestroika, which was complete restructuring of the economy and the government, away from pure communism towards a free market system. The way I remember the difference between glasnost and perestroika: glasnost is openness, freedom of speech. If you have a glass window, you can open it and shout out the window. Perestroika deals with the economy and restructuring government. Perestroika starts with a P, just like prices, and there's prices to pay in our economy and tax to pay to the government with those prices. Glasnost and perestroika brought many changes about in the Soviet Union. In 1986, there was a disaster at a nuclear power plant. This was in North Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the Soviet Socialist republics, so this did happen in what is now the former Soviet Union, but Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. There was a nuclear power plant, and they were doing a test, and a mistake happened during the test, and the nuclear reactor exploded. It wasn't actually just a mistake. There's a lot more to it. There had been certain things in place that were unsafe, and there were people pushing for the test to be done beyond the limits. There's an HBO miniseries called Chernobyl that really details what happened at Chernobyl during this time. But basically, as a result of a test that was taking place, a reactor exploded. The impact of this was 30 to 40 times greater than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Chernobyl disaster is a symbol for the horror and uncontrolled nuclear power and a symbol of the collapse of the Soviet Union. When this first took place, people were not aware of how devastating it would be, and they also did not let people know about the dangers involved. People had to evacuate nearby towns, and people still don't live in them today. Many people say Chernobyl represented the collapse and the weakening of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet Union is what we'll talk about next. Gorbachev's reforms weakened the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and the satellite states. November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Germany and the city of Berlin were unified. Today, there is just one Germany. There are not separate nations of East or West Germany. Nationalism increased in Warsaw Pact countries, and gradually, these Eastern Bloc countries gained their independence as well. Then, in 1991, Communist leader Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president. The Soviet Union had fallen, and the Cold War was officially over. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin became the new president of Russia. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of those satellite states became independent countries. Some of them became democracies, while others remained communist countries but were independently ruled. The collapse of the Soviet Union and communist governments across Eastern Europe saw the creation of many new nations and also an increase of NATO members. New countries that were created as the Soviet Union fell were the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Lithuania. Yugoslavia also ended, and that country was divided up into independent countries. That includes Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Montenegro. Now, you'll remember the genocide that was committed in some of these regions that were former Yugoslavia after these countries were created. Czechoslovakia also ceased to exist, and it became two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So everything in red had been part of or controlled by the Soviet Union, and they became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. These were actually the different socialist republics, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So 15 new nations